Ever since the launch of Nintendo Switch Online, Pokémon fans have been begging for the classic games to come to the platform. After all, with the shutdown of the Wii U and 3DS eShops, there's now no legal way to purchase these games from Nintendo. I mean, you would think titles like Pokémon Emerald and Pokémon Fire Red would be extremely beneficial to the value of NSO, but clearly there's something holding Nintendo back from putting these games on the service. I think the first reason that comes to most people's minds is just money. More specifically, how can the Pokémon company make the most money off of you? At first, you would think that the sales boost of NSO from retro Pokémon games is something that Nintendo would want, but I actually think it's a little deeper than that. What if the reason for Game Freak not adding older games has to do with them wanting you to buy the current games? I know it might sound silly, but hear me out. The Pokémon company knows that games like Pokémon Emerald, Fire Red, and Crystal are all amazing games in their own right. Perhaps they're afraid that if you play these older games, that will decrease the potential market of Scarlet and Violet, for example. Maybe they're thinking, why would you want to buy these $60 Pokemon games with a bad reputation when you could go to the Game Boy Advance emulator and play what many consider to be some of the best games in the series? Obviously, there are some counter arguments to this as well. Pokemon is already present within NSO via the trading card game and Pokemon Stadium 1 and 2. Admittedly, these games are not really full Pokemon adventures and more of battle simulators, so my original point still stands here. These spin-off games simply wouldn't steal players from the modern titles. In terms of the legitimacy of my argument towards Game Freak's greed though, it's entirely in character for them to do something like this. The heads of the Pokémon company have recently proved to the gaming world that they are willing to do some very scummy things to make an extra buck. For example, instead of making the Gen 4 remakes into full-fledged new games like they used to do with Omega Ruby and Heart Gold, they handed Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl off to a team that had barely made any games before. Now, I don't want to send any hate towards the developers of these remakes. Instead, I want to simply point out that they were most likely underpaid to make a game that brought in an insane amount of money. This is where the Pokémon company realized how profitable laziness can truly be. More importantly, this is where they really drifted away from caring about what the players have to say about their games. And the worst part about this whole thing is, well, they're kind of right. At least in a business sense. Giving the fans what we wanted would have actually made them significantly less money in all likelihood. Let's say that we did get an amazingly developed Gen 4 remake made exclusively by Game Freak's best developers. This would result in the loss of Pokémon Legends Arceus, at least in the short term. This isn't even a huge issue though, since nobody would really be too upset if a game like that was delayed, and in some ways it did need more time in the oven anyway. The big problem would be for the Pokémon company, since they would probably make half as much money in that scenario. Perhaps an amazing Gen 4 remake would have been the best selling Pokémon game of all time, but I have a feeling that it still would have not sold more than the combo release of Pokémon Legends Arceus and BDSP. Knowing all of this, you can see why the Pokémon company took the low ground of just handing such an important project off like the remakes. It's because it was literally free money for them. All they had to do was make sure that the games were mostly faithful to the originals and added a teeny tiny bit of extra content. Improving something like the graphics was never important to them, so they released Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl knowing exactly what would happen. The game would sell thanks to your nostalgia, and the new wave of children who play games on the Switch wouldn't know any better. They knew the reviews would be mixed because the game was clearly made with no passion, but it wouldn't matter because they made their money. And hey, if you didn't like those games, at least they had Legends Arceus, which was a brand new experience that would shock the world. In some ways, yes, an open world Pokemon game was revolutionary, but let's be real, people had been making fan games like that for years already. With all of this being said, I'm sure you understand the perspective of the Pokemon company now. Make money in the easiest way possible. Let's bring it back to Nintendo Switch Online though. Obviously, the Pokemon company wants to make money, we know that, but there certainly could be other reasons for excluding games from NSO. A big reason I've heard over the past year has been the Pokemon Home situation. For those unfamiliar, Pokemon Home allows you to transfer Pokemon between games. If the retro Pokemon games were to come to NSO, Home wouldn't be available because of the potential for exploitation using the rewind feature to shiny reset or something like that. Also recall how the Pokemon games are ineligible for cloud saves due to the potential for cloning Pokemon. I don't really buy this as a solid explanation for retro titles not being on NSO at all though. I mean, we don't need Pokemon Home for these super old games. Most of us just want the option of playing them at all. In a sense, this leads to the idea that these games don't even need to be on NSO, just the eShop. People who think Pokemon Home or cloud saves are the reason they aren't on NSO expect these retro games to release as individual titles. If this happened, all the Pokemon Home features would be available and you wouldn't have to buy NSO. Honestly, this is ideal for a lot of people. It is one thing to not have these games on NSO, that I understand, but not having these games on the Switch at all, that's just silly. In the past, these Pokemon games have been put on the 3DS for a few bucks a pop, and they were yours to keep. The fact that you literally have to pirate these games in order to play them now is just ridiculous. Or well, I guess you could buy them secondhand, but good luck with that. Listen, I just think it's silly how I can play Pokemon Red on my calculator before I can play it on the Switch. But considering how long it's been at this point, I'm starting to think that the ports won't even be coming to Switch at all. I mean, they certainly could still release some sort of bundle package during this presumably last year of the Switch, but I don't know, is that actually gonna happen? I feel like the only scenario they would do an individual release is if the next game they're making is a really long time away and they have a huge gap in games. Perhaps a title like Pokemon All-Stars could come out to fill that gap. Now that we've gone over some of the main theories as to why we don't have these games yet, let's bring in an idea that really stood out to me. Remember Pokemon Let's Go? This was a Gen 1 remake for sure, but take a look at the trailers for the game and put yourself in the shoes of a 10-year-old. Does this look like a remake or a brand new game? What if the Pokemon company simply wants you to forget that the old games ever happened? Think about it, could it be that they want to recapture the hype of the originals through the remakes? By keeping classic games off of the Switch, a remake of the game will seem like a brand new adventure to a lot of younger gamers. This Pokemon Let's Go situation isn't the only example of marketing remakes as new games though. Just take a look at the Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door remake. Nothing about the trailer was screaming, "This is a remake," allowing the game to appeal to both fans of the series and new players seeing it for the first time. If we want to look into the most likely scenario of why we don't really have retro Pokemon on the Switch though, it's probably just a dispute between Nintendo and the rest of the Pokemon Company. Keep in mind, the Pokemon Company is a joint venture between Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc., meaning each of them have about 33% of the say in what happens with Pokemon as an IP. So while Nintendo would love to put these games on their service and take the free money from new subscriptions, Game Freak probably isn't too fond of this. They probably want to keep those old Pokemon games in the vault unless an incredibly profitable scenario appears. That scenario would certainly not be on NSO for them unless they got some crazy cuts of the profit. Not to mention, Game Freak would certainly want Pokemon Home to be accessible to these older games and absolutely no instances of save states or rewinding. The Pokemon Company likely views these games as potential cash cows, and putting them on a subscription service might be selling them short too. Now this doesn't mean they won't ever be coming though, and there are a few avenues as to how we'll be seeing retro Pokemon return. We obviously can't rule out the idea that they're saving these for the Switch 2 or whatever it's called release, assuming they don't have any new games ready, like a Gen 5 remake. Perhaps around Christmas time they'd release a bundle or something, but if this doesn't happen, I guess we still have time to see if they'll release on NSO. It's just really hard to say when. If you ask me personally, I don't really care whether or not these games come at this point. The emulation and modding community is growing larger and larger by the day, so it's not difficult to play these older Pokemon games. Even on the Switch, modding Pokemon onto it has proven to not be that difficult. Obviously, modding and emulating isn't for everyone, especially because you have to obtain ROMs of these games through alternative means. But for the people that really care, the options are there for you. I mean, I've been playing through Pokemon Emerald for the first time through an emulator, and it is absolutely amazing so far. I'm able to upscale the graphics of my game to look really smooth, and I could even mod it to further my experience if I wanted to. So if you're someone who's been waiting for retro Pokemon to come back to the Switch, maybe it's time to give up on the Pokemon Company and take matters into your own hands through emulation.